Hello, my lovelies. Welcome back to Story Time with the Intimacy Ally. I am joined today by Ms. Adelina Adler. She and I met because we were both in the Sexual Health Alliance sex coaching program,
Mhm.
and we have since become colleagues and friends and joined each other in networking groups, and hopefully we'll get to see each other in person one of these days.
Soon, soon, yes. I will find myself there.
And she uses she, they as pronouns,
Mhm.
and we like to normalize pronouns. So I'm going to hand it over to you and ask if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, Jenny. I am Adelina Adler, pronouns she, they. I am a sex coach and educator based out of southeastern North Carolina. Um, and I'm focused on GSRD or gender, sexual, and relationship diverse communities. I've got over 4 years of experience in empowerment, education, and community building initiatives. And I'm a former sex worker, current kinkster, and host of my own podcast, Sexplorations with Adelina Adler, available on YouTube and Spotify, and soon to be revamped and coming back out. So look forward to that.
Woo-wee. You are so busy. My goodness.
It sounds like that.
Hands in every pot. I like it.
Mm.
Um, and you never run out of interesting things to say. So I know that it's totally worth it that you have your hands in so many pots. Um, So, we're going to talk today about the myths surrounding virginity.
Mm. Mhm.
So, I guess I'll start this off with why it came up for me, which is I was talking to another person on the show about religion and how it plays into the guilt, shame,
Yeah.
fear of sexuality.
Mhm.
And she was a LCSWC, licensed professional counselor, social worker,
Mhm.
and or no, that's not what that means. I think it's licensed. I can't remember. Licensed clinical social worker. There we
Yes.
go. That's the one. Um, but she had read this book by Jessica Valenti that is the purity myth, how America's obsession with virginity is hurting young women. And we talked a little bit about that, but we just scratched the surface. So I felt like it really deserved its own episode because I know from my personal experience, um, it meant something. Like it
Mhm,
really, really
mhm,
meant something to me. Like when I was a virgin, when I wasn't a virgin, and like where that line broke for me.
mhm,
And then as I got older, it was like, oh, so that doesn't mean when this happens, or that doesn't necessarily have to align with this person's thought of what my virginity means. Um, so I feel like that's really important. And also, I know that you have all of this amazing knowledge about the history of it.
mhm.
So I guess I'd really love to know, where would you like to start?
Well, first and foremost, I think it's also important to kinda touch on the fact that this was something that I grew up believing was pivotal to my value and existence too. I grew up in a very conservative, Christian household,
Mm,
and with a lot of the messaging and ideologies that we're going to discuss today, and I know firsthand how that affected me psychologically and, the amounts of shame and ideas of self-worth that it implanted in me from a very young age, and I continue to see this in other people and how it affects them, like, a lot of times in my work, and what also a big part of what drove me to my work, was detangling a lot of the aftermath that comes
mm,
from people having this kind of idea or relationship with their sex and their bodies, that kind of puts them at odds with each other. So, I remember the process that I went through to kind of deconstruct and challenge and reexamine those paradigms, and so I kind of did a crash course really quick little version of that for this podcast today with you knew as soon as I saw this on your list of ideas, a fire lit up inside me because this is it is so close to home.
You're like, "This is the one."
Mhm. Yep. I was like, "What could I just go ham on?" And it is this, absolutely. I did wanna start off with, just a note for our listeners out there too, referring to, the language that we're gonna be using. Um, I'm gonna be referring a lot to gender in the binary sense here because, unfortunately, our society is obsessed with the idea of gender roles, and while
Right.
gender itself.
Almost as much as they're obsessed with the idea of virginity,
Oh,
right? Holy
yes!
shit.
I mean, it's part of the gender role over here discussion. It
Yes.
really is tantamount to it. And while we understand, that gender is a construct, is a societal construct, and is not a dichotomous, strict binary by any means, the way our society has treated it is of particular relevance to this topic. So just keep that in mind during the duration of the program. And also, on that note, I will be referring mostly to the Western experience of virginity and sexuality. So while a lot of these ideas can be applicable to Eastern and other areas as well, mostly what's going to be looked at, especially historically speaking, here is going to be Western influence too.
Right, because it really is like a whole different ball game when
Mhm.
you get into other countries, other cultures, what have you.
I mean, there's a lot of similarities, honestly, but I'm gonna stay in the lane that I'm familiar
Okay,
with. So
very good.
that's why I'm just
Mhm,
gonna be like, it can't be a broad stroke kinda thing
gotcha.
or situation. So, yeah.
Alright. So let's jump in.
Mhm.
What are you gonna share with us about the history of the notion of virginity?
All right, buckle up, buckaroos, because it's a long one here. Well, first off, I wanted to start by examining who is getting these messages given to them. Because, um, it's technically both men and women get these messages to certain degrees, especially throughout like childhood and adolescence. However, there is a significance in the emphasis placed on the importance of women's virginity specifically.
You don't say.
I know, imagine that. It's
They don't want us to have the sex? No way.
no, never. They never police our pussies. Oh, am
Of
I allowed
course
to
not.
say that
Of
here?
course not.
Oh my god.
Yeah, fuck yeah. Yeah,
Okay, good.
yeah. Mm,
All right. So we have this idea. It's tied to the idea of purity, value, goodness, and worth. And it's framed usually as different because a vagina is seen as receiving and passive versus the penis or the active and giving role. I remember growing up and hearing that argument as well when discussing
mm,
this with friends and saying, well, why is it different for me to be sexually active and it's completely okay for you? And the argument I'd get is, well, you're allowing somebody into your body, like somebody's entering your body. And I was like, okay, well, weird. But we see this even in the language and the linguistic principles of the fact. The word vagina is from the Latin meaning sheath and scabbard, which directly defines it in relation and correspondence to the penis. Vulva, too, comes from the Latin for womb, again, framing the region in relation to its service, especially in the male aspect. Um,
mhm.
and while we're at it, virgin comes from the Latin virgo, meaning an unmarried woman. So
Oh,
virginity in its own context is a feminine idea or a feminine centered idea in and of itself. So while we
wow.
see messages kind of geared towards both, there is a very strong like, the people who are getting the virginity tests are women. Like, it's
Mhm,
it's it's very much on the woman's side that it seems to be a problem for society. There's also an interesting cultural carryover from Roman ideologies on masculinity. Um,
mhm,
so Thomas Nelson Winter in 1973 in his book, Catalyst Purified: A Brief History of Carmen 16, which was looking at Catalyst, the Roman poets, kind of saucy and yeah, it was very, at the time, let's censor this, poetry.
nice.
He writes that apparently Catalyst and his contemporaries believed that a man could do almost anything sexually and remain respectable so long as he stayed within the masculine role. And we see this fact and ideas like it a lot of in the LGBTQ arguments as well, defining that like the idea of homosexuality wasn't necessarily even a thing, even in Greco-Roman times. Like as long as you could have sex with anyone if you were a man, as long as they were of lower status than you, and as long as you were, like the top and you were the one in control and your manhood
Right.
and idea of masculinity was preserved. So over time, like as the messages have branched out and kind of molded, the original source of these kind of core ideas uh remains in
Mhm.
so the original messages of virginity are are historically utilitarian, but I'll get back to
Okay.
that later. So
Okay.
where do we get these messages usually? Like what would you say are some of the places we hear these kind of.
Oh, so I feel like I heard it through movies and TV more than I did, like, in my home. Uh, I
Okay.
had a I had a very different, like, upbringing. I'm the baby of 6. Like, by the time
Mhm.
they got to me and my brother, who's only a little older, like, they were kinda done, like, just kinda checked out and, like,
Like, we
"Go,
did our best
be
here.
home at some time," you know? But in movies, you would hear things like, "Why buy the cow when you can get the milk for free?"
Mhm.
Um, you would see these terrible interpretations in like after school specials or even like the TV shows that we were watching where people would lose it and then they would just feel so terrible, so
Mhm.
broken,
Mhm.
and everything changed and they can never get it back. Oh, and you can never get it back. That was a thing I remember from like high school.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. That
Yeah.
that is definitely on the list that I made here. I started with, sex ed classes in school, which while the focus wasn't necessarily on virginity itself, like, the ones that focused on abstinence a lot,
Mhm.
tended to frame sex through risk, and I remember having this exposure chart, which I linked to you, and anyone all you have to do is look up Google exposure chart, and you'll see it. It's this chart that has, like, all these bodies, and it says and it's supposed to give you how many bodies you're exposed to, the more people you have sex with. The idea being that you're having sex with all the people that those people had sex with too. And
Right.
it's really funny to me because I even ran into like a modern idea of that in the spiritual community, in another podcast I was being interviewed in, where they're like,
Mhm.
we don't like there's a thought about, frowning upon casual sex because their energy stays with you and it clings onto you, and I
Mhm.
was like, "Oh, listen, it's giving a lot of exposure chart, actually," and, like, if you're a healer like, in this community, if you're a healer or anything like you're exposed to people's energies all the time. This is why sage is a thing, so but, like, there's this idea that you're tainted, you're impure, you're getting tarnished. You're getting
Right.
tarnished. It's giving the chewed up bubblegum analogy. So,
Mhm.
we get it also from parents who are just, passing down what they were taught, peers in media, which is what you were
Mhm.
talking about. We get a lot of the Madonna versus whore complex kind of modalities,
Even though
where
you're supposed to be both, right?
mhm, mhm. The lady in the street, but a freak in the bed. Say it. Yes, kind of things like
Mhm.
that. We hear all these male podcasts talking about body counts and their preoccupation with women's body counts, um,
Right.
which honestly stems from insecurity of men, because if you're a virgin, you have nothing to compare your experience to. Like
Right.
the people who used to have a problem with a high body count, I found, were the ones who were the most insecure about their sexual prowess, and they were worried about competition and
Right.
how they would measure up. It's a very egocentric,
Mhm.
preoccupation, honestly.
Absolutely.
And then we come to
So
the oh, go no, no, go
no,
ahead,
no,
go
no.
ahead.
Come on, bring it, bring it. I wanna hear the last one that you had.
Alright, well, I don't know because this is the big one that trails off into others. So,
Alright,
the
come on.
okay. We got religion. And which is where it started with you guys and why we're here today here. So many
Mhm.
Christian or puritanical and honestly other kind of patriarchal based religions too. Like we see Mormonism, a bunch of others.
Oh, fuck yeah.
Mhm. Beliefs emphasize staying pure for future spouses, usually turning a blind eye, however, to boys' sexual behaviors. We see the role of the woman as being subservient and serving her husband. Virginity is loyalty and part of serving. It's
Mhm.
posed as an act of love and devotion to the future spouse, as well as a testament to your holiness. Um, at this rate, then, your body is not seen as your own, but a gift to be given to your husband. And that's why white is worn on the wedding gown as a representative of your purity and untouchedness. Um,
Right.
So with that,
Super gross.
I mean, we've got like
Super gross.
purity balls, virginity balls, where fathers will like
Mhm.
vow to protect their daughters' virginities, and they will like kind of pseudo marry their fathers in like a symbolic way until
Mhm.
he gives her forward to the man who's supposed to be her husband and take her virginity and live happily ever after. Um,
Oh,
so
super gross. Cool.
there's a lot of
Amazing. Oh
layers
my
of
god.
religion. But like I
Whew.
remember in that space, it felt like it was the ultimate act of love and of proving yourself. Like, there was this idea of, like, "Ah, I am a special gift." Like, it's phrased like you're the special thing, but it is ultimately an objectification of your value, in that way. We see this because yeah, and then virginity directly ties to your value in this sense. Like, you get all these analogies bombarded with you. The plucked flower analogy. Have you ever heard that one?
Mhm.
Where, for those who aren't familiar, if you're, there's a flower in a beautiful garden grove and it's desired by all. But as soon as it is plucked, it withers and dies and loses its value. Or, the way I heard it from a boy trying to degrade me was that, every partner plucks your petals, and at the end, who just wants a nasty little stem?
Hmm.
That's how it was said to me. I was like,
Delightful.
"Oh, cute." Or we get
See,
the
this takes me back to TV with
Mhm.
Jane the Virgin
Oh.
because did you ever watch that show?
No, I was a shut-in. I wasn't allowed to watch secular TV.
Ah, all right. So Jane the Virgin is amazing. And it's all about kind of reinterpreting this story that's happening in the US through like a format of telenovelas. So it's
Mhm.
really cool. Um, but Jane the Virgin, her grandmother says, "You see this flower?" And then crushes it up and says, "That's what happens if you give it away. It's destroyed, isn't it?" So then she doesn't want to have sex. And then oh, that whole theory of once it's gone, or that it's destroyed, or that it makes you this disgusting, unwanted thing if you get rid of it. Holy
Oh,
shit.
girl, it becomes even more
Ugh.
evident with the chewed gum analogy, which is one I recently learned of that's going around where, the instructor will ask, "Oh, do you want a piece of gum?" And the person will say, "Yeah,"
Mhm.
and then he chews on it and then tries to give you the chewed piece of gum, and that's supposed to be like, "Oh, you don't want it if it's been chewed by somebody else?" It's
Mhm.
equating you to trash. Chewed gum is
Mhm.
something that goes in the garbage. So you get this analogy of your utility, your beauty, your value, if you lose your virginity, is
Mhm.
done. I did see
Right.
a funny take on it on TikTok where they tried to reverse it, to be like the male-centered version where it was a pencil sharpener analogy, and she and she kept sharpening the pencil. She's like, "Who wants to use a nubby little pencil? It's been used by every other sharpener." And I laugh because, honestly, it's the same feeling, but we don't see it ever framed that way. It is always framed
Right?
in the feminine-centered language. I mean, and like you said, like, we use the language of losing our virginity because, again, once you lose it, your value is lost. Under this lens, what changes fundamentally is your value as a prospective long-term partner and as a woman. So,
Right.
um, so what I did when after growing up with this kind of lovely idea,
Mhm.
um, was look at the historical importance of virginity. Like, when did this begin? Was it always like this? And the answer is No. Kind of? No. Yes, but not in the way that we think. So the original purpose and utility value of virginity is tied to the anthropological theory of paternity uncertainty. Do you know what that is?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's the same reason that in the Jewish religion, it passes through the mom because they couldn't trust us hoes.
Yes. So basically, well, like while a woman can be 100% certain that her kids are her own, the man cannot. This is, and so while this is different in modern times where there's like blood tests and things like that, back then, when marriage was a tool to expand families, accumulate wealth, and form alliances, or like in her book, Marriage a History, Stephanie Kuntz writes, it was a way of getting in laws and making alliances and expanding the family labor force. Um, Daughters were
Mhm.
bartered, and marriages were a matter of familial convenience and strategy. So when it came
Yep.
Yeah? So when it
Mhm.
came to passing down your estates and inheritances, it became really useful to know that the heir was actually your blood. And then, in certain societies, that started creating property rights and marriage laws. Um, that passed property down to children, monogamous marriages were a way of legitimizing those children's, and this is according to the research done by Dr. And I apologize for my pronunciation here, Aparaita Gidigunta. Um, so men could now claim wives and children as their property. Uh,
Mhm.
and so it was a lot cleaner when you were sure that it wasn't the baker's son. But, oh, fun fact, fun fact, during my anthropological, studies when I was an anthropology major and before I switched to so many other things, one of the projects we did locally for the city I live in was to digitize old deeds, old
Mhm.
property deeds, and
Mhm.
I found something really fun, which was the language "to have and to hold" was used in exchange of property. Like, we're talking about slaves.
Oh,
We're
wow.
talking about, like, buildings and businesses. So,
Mhm.
the "to have and to hold" part of your marriage vow comes from the language of property passing on. It comes from this era. Wild. Um,
Mhm. It's like
so
man and wife. It's not like man and woman is man and wife because you're getting handed over.
My wife.
Yep.
Yes, exactly. So, later on, consent of the couple and family approval, started kind of becoming considered as a prerequisite factor that could be kinda like a part of it. But in the West, it wasn't until the 18th and 19th century that marriage based on romance as the ideal started to emerge. Along with the Industrial Revolution and Enlightenment era came these ideas of individualism. And along with that, people choosing their own partners for the first time and leaving their community, like estates or things like that, and forming more familial kind of nuclear structures in the city, started becoming more of the norm. And after that, the ideas of the Romanticism era started really gassing up this idea of love being the ideal force behind marriage. And along with that, of course, there there was this these values concerning virginity. And also along this whole time, especially in the 1800s, we saw continued societal reformations that attempted to reel back sexuality and put purity on a pedestal. And if you want to read more about that,
Mhm.
I suggest A Curious History of Sex by Kate Lister. Fantastic. Also fantastic chapter on virginity on there too.
You're gonna have to send me all of these things so I can put them in the show notes. You know
Yeah,
that,
put them
right?
in the show notes. Yes,
You're giving me like a
absolutely.
whole bibliography here.
Oh, I've got him, girl. I've got him. I've got him set. So, what we see is even as society continued to change, so did the ways these messages were delivered up until, this day and age. Still, though, at the
Mhm.
root of it lies this pervasive idea that virginity or sexual modesty is of pivotal importance and, again, value. In particular, it dictates women's value.
Yep.
So, the next part is, of course, the harmful ramifications of this kind of framing. So, sex is a natural thing and sexuality is a natural human experience. I'm sure everyone who listens to your podcast probably agrees with that. Um, not to
Good Lord
discount the
willing and the crick don't rise. Yeah.
not to discount the ace community out there though, like valid
Mhm.
as well. But So these restrictions place great stress on the individuals trying to abide by them, like your value as a partner, and sometimes even as a follower of your god or deity or religious beliefs and values are tied to this. So what we get is people struggling to fight their body's natural responses. In this
Mhm,
psychological environment, it's no surprise then sexual shame begins to grow rampant. Because if you
mhm,
fail, you've lost your value. You're seen as weak in your faith, weak in your resolve, weak in upholding your own values. You're a chewed piece of gum, trash, again, incapable of trusting your body and yourself. And that is the censure here because it makes your sex and your body your enemy.
mhm.
And that's a lot of what I've had to work through with clients.
Mm.
In
Oh my
response,
god.
we see people trying to find loopholes. And there's one that you mentioned in
Yep.
particular. Yeah.
Yeah, there's been this whole eruption. I don't know when it started, honestly, but I feel like it's been going on since I was in high school of people who are extremely Christian,
Mhm.
um, Mormon, generally in the more fanatical sects, I think, because I could be wrong because I actually am not Christian, so I don't know. But they're like, okay, well, in the butt doesn't count because it's
Mhm.
not penis and vagina sex. That's what counts.
Yeah.
In the mouth doesn't count because that's not the vagina. That's all that we have to deal with here. It kind of makes me feel like that's that myth of like sex or virginity loss is equivalent to breaking the hymen
Oh, yeah.
or
It's exactly
something
tied to
along
that.
those lines. And I don't know about you, but my hymen got broken when I was like 9 because I was riding my brother's bike and it had like the little bar like in
Mhm.
between and I couldn't figure out how to make it break. So I jumped down
Mhm.
and I broke my hymen. Like,
It's
so I
it's
didn't
just
lose my virginity then,
it's
but
just a little
I
piece of
broke my
tissue
hymen.
that
Yeah.
stretches. It usually doesn't even break, it stretches, and, like, um but the problem is, like, you're right, like, that that has for so long been the standard of checking female virginity or vaginal virginity is
Mhm.
the two-finger test, the hymen test. I've heard of there was, like, recently this singer who was checking his daughter's virginity or having his daughter go to a doctor to consistently check her virginity, and I remember that was the first time I really wanted to make an episode about this. So I'm glad I got to do this with you at some point in time, but it's still a preoccupation. But it's really interesting here. Also, another good example is Mormons and soaking. Have you heard of soaking?
Mm-mm.
So for
Do
them,
tell.
okay, so for some of them, they think that sex itself, it can be P and V, but as long as the P isn't thrusting. So what they'll
I'm
do,
sorry, what?
yeah, as long as the penis isn't actually thrusting or moving actively and willfully inside of the vagina, then it's fine. So what they'll do is called soaking, and they'll put it in, but they won't move. And maybe you'll have a good friend jump on the bed to kind of instigate movement.
No way.
Yes. I've had
No
Mormon
fucking
friends. It's
way.
a real thing. It's a real thing. Like, the loopholes that people get are wild because, again, we're trying to fight our body's natural impulses without any, sex ed to go along with it or healthy sexual outlets or anything like that. You're taught that masturbation also is usually really bad, so you've got a lot
Mhm.
of pent up, like, "Huh." I remember reading my diary entries, and I revisited them recently, and your girl was holy and horny. Like, I was constantly I didn't hadn't watched pornography or anything, so I didn't really know what I want, but I knew I wanted
You knew you were
something. I
hungry. You just
wanted
didn't know
to
what
kiss
for.
and hold hands vigorously and maybe
Mm.
maybe feel hugs, maybe feel some
And
really
just, like,
tight hugs.
rub against somebody.
Yeah, yeah,
Mhm.
I was ooh, and
Mhm.
then I would be writing, I was like, "Oh god, please, please make me strong, because I don't know if I can do it." Luckily, I
And
was
I
ugly.
hate that too, like, that it's about strength or it's about
It's your
your
personal
will,
strength and will.
your strength, what have you.
It
Uh,
attacks you on so many levels. It attaches itself to so much of your personal worth and, like, ability. Like,
mhm.
and that's why it's so invasive, like, um and it makes me laugh because it makes me think of, like, we get to what is the definition of sex, and you brought up a scene in a movie, uh,
Chasing Amy?
a Kevin Smith film. Yes.
Yeah.
I love Chasing Amy, when I
It's,
watched it,
like, my favorite well, one of my favorite movies, but yeah.
and I the what was the argument there? Like,
So, Holden has found out that Alyssa is a lesbian, and he's like, "Oh, so you're a virgin," because he assumes that she's never been with a man, and assumption number 1 for him there. But 2, she's like, "Wait a second, so you think that I can only have lost my virginity if I slept with a man?" And he's like, "Well, that's the standard." And then she says,
compulsory
"Oh, okay."
heteronormativity. Mhm.
Right, she's like, "Oh, okay, so if a girl is raped, then she's lost her virginity." And he's like, "Well, no." And she's like, "Oh, but according to you, she just had sex with a man, so that's the standard." And he's like, "All right, well, not then." He's like, "Okay, it happens when the hymen's broken." And she has a similar story to mine, that she fell at some point and broke hers, so she doesn't have one or didn't have one when she got old enough to be interested in sex. How about that? Uh, then he says, "All right, second correction. It happens when there's penetration." And she says, "Well, no." And he says, "Penetration from a man." And she's like, "No." And he's like, "Oh, but you can't have penetration." And she's like, So he's like, "Oh my God."
We're strap-ons, come on.
Right, exactly. But the thing is, there's that definition that it has to be taken or destroyed or,
Oh,
conquered
uh,
by a man.
on a weird perspective, my one of my partners, Dev, a cis male, um, he described having pure terror because he was also born in a religious household and grew up learning these ideas, and he expressed pure terror at his first time having sex with a woman because he felt like he was violating her. Like,
No.
even if it was consent, like, in his mind, he tells the story, in his mind, he had vilified himself for his first time having sex with a girl because he thought he had ruined her. Like, and then
Oh, no.
later on, like, as they were older, like, she told him that she and some of her girlfriends were, sharing stories about their sexual debuts, and
Mhm,
which, by the way, better term than losing virginity, sexual debuts, let's normalize that one. But
mhm,
and, they were all sharing their terrible stories and, like, just lackluster things, and she
mhm.
was like, "I actually, had a really nice experience. My person was super thoughtful, like, really considerate, blah, blah, blah," and, like, it boggled his mind to hear that because he had grown up with yes, the kind of reverse idea of this, of, like, you are trespassing on
Mhm.
someone's body, and
You are destroying her flower.
her
How
value,
dare you?
you are
Unless you're
devaluing.
going to take her. How
Mhm.
dare you?
Mhm.
Mhm,
Like, and it's wild because, like, I mean, if you're having the anal version of the sex, does the man lose his virginity then? Again, that's not the question. That is never the question. Like,
mm-mm.
it's always about the woman's experience. And yeah, we our lesbian pride parades just like virginity.
Right, it's just
celebration.
like, "This is the land of virgins, didn't you know?"
Mhm, but again, like,
Because
in that lens, it's heteronormative. The marriage, the sanctity of it's supposed to
very.
be with a man and a woman. You're supposed to procreate and give
Right.
life.
And I mean, I get it, like, that movie is from 1997.
Yeah,
A
I don't know if
lot
it still
has
stands up.
changed and happened since
Mhm.
then in many in sex, ugh, in many, like, areas, in different groups of people. they don't think this way anymore. It has changed a little bit.
Mhm.
But then we get the next generation of what you were taught. Like, I remember mentioning that to you. Did you get to look at anything that Paul and Morgan do?
No, I didn't actually get to see what
I'm
they're
so
up to.
sorry.
No,
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 I'm
this is
not.
an
I'm not
opportunity.
sorry. I'm not sorry at all.
Tell me, share.
They're just awful. They're the fucking worst. They are in the Shiny Happy People documentary that's out right now about the fucking Duggars. And the thing about the Duggars is, their oldest son was like molesting a bunch of their daughters because he came up in a fucking house where they don't tell you anything and they tell you not to sleep with anybody, and then you get curious, well, what are you going to do? Oh, you're going to go diddle your sister, right?
Ooh,
Because you think that's okay,
it's because
right?
what's accessible.
Yep. So these two are in the same faith base as the Duggars. They were in the Shiny Happy People documentary, and they do all this crap on YouTube and Instagram, and that's how they've gotten famous for being a couple that, like, she slept with someone before she slept with him, but they're married, and he forgave her for losing her virginity and for being a woman who came to him as virginityless um, all the time. But
Mhm.
they also give all this fucking dating and Christian moral and relationship and marriage advice. And there's, like I said, 20,000 followers on their Instagram.
I mean, because it's still a pervasive idea, like, in these purity culture, spaces where that is part of, the aforementioned role that you're supposed to play, this idea has not gone extinct. Like,
Nope.
on the wider kind of scale, yes, we do see a lot more information with this information age being passed out, and, teenagers and adolescents are at least more aware of, like, consent and things like that, and what and starting to have these discussions, hopefully, about, like, what constitutes the idea of sex, because, I mean, even in my subjective definition of it that I came up with, which, was the experience of intentional, continuous, erogenous arousal involving 2 or more persons, and again, it's a subjective experience because
Mm-hmm.
definitions are slightly are different, like, for somebody, oral sex is sex to them, and for somebody else,
Mm-hmm.
maybe it doesn't count. Um,
Right.
that's why it's important to talk about these things before engaging with anyone, just as
Right.
but, like, it's still very pervasive, and, like, unfortunately, it leads to, like, people jumping into bad relationships early, like, toxic
Mm-hmm.
situationships that they trigger warning, talk of, SA and
Mm-hmm.
R. For my experience, I lost my virginity at 14,
Mm-hmm.
and it wasn't consensual, in that instance. I remember because I was a little, holy horn dog, as I said beforehand, I was
Mm-hmm.
very excited and eager for the makeouts and that nearness. But the partner I had at the time, was one of those who dumb boy, we'll just say he was really dumb and just as misled and, ignorant to a lot of the
Mm-hmm.
factors at play. And I'm 35. This was from a time before these talks of, like, consent and continuous consent and all of these things were going
Right.
on. And a lot of these other myths like blue balls and, "Oh, it hurts, eh." It was a thing that was widely believed. So, like, he would say it physically pained him to not be able to release or do anything or to have this sexual tension. So, I remember that oh, yes, let's take breaths. So, I remember that, like, he would try to get me to do certain things. I'd be like, "No, no, no. I'm not doing that. You go into the other half of the basement, which was kinda walled off, and you take care of that yourself." But
Mm-hmm.
that encroached more and more. At one point in time, I will admit I did try. I did try to have sex with him, and it hurt a lot, and I didn't get really far at all past, like just the tip. And I was like, "No, no, 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 never mind. This is not no, this is not for me."
Mhm.
Plus, no. The way I was getting around it in my head was, "It's okay. We're gonna get married after this." So
Aw.
the naivete. But so but the time it did happen, I remember that it kinda seemed like a calculated thing, like the family all conveniently left at the same time on a walk and left us
Mm.
alone. And it was I remember when people say that they go into this space of, disassociation, it's a very real thing.
Yep.
With many people I've spoken to, have similar experiences. Because whereas that first time when I was actively attempting it, things hurt, I felt absolutely nothing. But all I could
Mhm.
see was the image of my white dress up in flames and the
Oh,
disapproval
wow.
of my parents. And I remember looking at him with tears in my eyes saying, "I'm not pure anymore." And
Oh, honey.
he started bawling on top of me, granted, okay? So he was like, "No, no, it'll be okay, we'll get married, it'll be fine." And I was like, "Yeah." But, like, so yeah, like, needless to say, spoiler alert, that did not happen. I got dumped, like, 2 weeks later and
Mhm.
carried that secret in myself for 2 years that it had
Mm.
happened, and I tried to, like, recontextualize it and, like, remap it cognitively in my head and, like, kinda rewrite the story so I was in power and, like, consenting
Mhm.
and things like that. But the reality of it was, no. I mean, bittersweet ending was when I did reunite with him, like, 2 years later, so after I was a sexually autonomous individual and already active,
Mhm.
the first thing he asked me was, "I am so sorry, Adelina, did I ruin your life?" So, he had carried that with him, but, like, that just the harm that comes from having that idea and that pressure placed on you
Mhm.
is so, so grave because I can only imagine how it would have been if I had grown up in an environment that, was sexually positive and, taught me about sexual debuts and like what instead of like framing it as an all or nothing thing, like this is going to be, you should be supposed to be looking for your husband, you're one person. This is the person you're going to devote your whole life to. Instead of framing it so drastically, it was a more natural thing of, "Listen, here's how you can do this responsibly. These are some things to look out for, red flags, things like that." God, the relationship I would
Here
have
are
with my
some lessons on
Yes.
consent. Here is
Yes.
the way that it's not a blanket term. Like, you
Mhm.
can rescind it at any point during this act.
Mhm.
It's not going to hurt him.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
things like that. And that you're just trying somebody on. Like,
Yeah.
you
Well,
don't
I
have
don't
to
like
think of it as anything harder than that,
I
though.
don't like that phrase either because it still sounds kind of like you're using somebody. You're sharing an
Oh,
experience with people. You're sharing experiences with
right.
people, and this is learning. You're allowed to I saw a really good analogy on Reddit. They
Okay.
this person, I forgot the user's name, but they said that they would like to view sex as, a cast iron skillet. So,
Ooh.
yeah,
So
like
it
you
just
take
adds to the seasoning.
Yes, and you take
Mm.
care of it, you learn how to maintain it and cultivate it, and so, yes,
Mhm.
and the flavors become more robust and enriched
And
and nurtured
complex.
and complex the
Mhm.
more you have the more you experience it well,
Right.
or mindfully, like so, because, of course, I don't like broad generalizations, and I do think that things in moderate not moderation, but, like, excess can be bad, like,
Mhm.
can have its flags. But yeah,
Right.
like how different that would have been and how much better.
Absolutely. And just freeing and allowing you to be a kid who doesn't have to worry about things like that, and then being a young adult who doesn't have to worry about that being such a heavy burden
Mhm.
while you're trying to let your brain develop,
I was about to
you
say,
know?
neurologically speaking, there is a certain part of your brain that is responsible because another major I went through was neuroscience.
Of course it
I've been
was.
a dude, I've been a geek. Like, so, like, there's a certain part of your brain, that is, and again, my things are fuzzy, this was a while back that I learned this, that is responsible for, like, vicarious not vicarious learning, but, like, kind of the math that goes on that allows you to kinda think about the consequences of your actions,
Mhm.
in layman's terms. Um, that doesn't develop fully in most people until you're about 25.
Yep.
So, like, and this is why we see teenagers, like, going into doing riskier behaviors or indulging in riskier behaviors. That part hasn't quite developed yet. And this, the caretaking of your gift, your virginity, is such a long-term thing. It's being framed in this long-term investment kind of stance, which you don't necessarily have the capacity to manage by yourself.
No.
Nevertheless, with such poor information and education on your side, and all of these fear-based, incentives and initiatives,
Right.
like, yeah, it's
Wild. Wild.
wild.
Well, I was gonna ask you what can we do moving forward, but I feel like you already answered it, talking about it as in a sexual debut instead of losing your gift or,
Mhm.
giving away the milk for free or crushing the flower or whatever the shitty term or imagery is that you had. Try not to share that with your kids. Try not to
No.
share that with your little nieces and nephews, your cousins, people who look up to you, people who are coming to you, asking you in your faith-based communities, in your, work communities, in, your school areas, whatever. Don't propagate this.
And I think that's why I find it so important to share the history of things, because it was important for me to understand and grasp the amount of what are societal constructs? What is a thing that changes with society based on its needs and priorities at the time? A lot of these ideas are based on the culture around it, which means they are not immutable. They are subject to change. These are not necessarily valid sources to base your ideas of personal value on. So when I learned the
Mhm,
history, I was able to say, oh, do I agree with this? Does this still hold water? What then is my sexuality, my relationship with it? What is my value on my terms? What are
mhm,
values that I can stand by? And build it from there, because there are some people who will want to be more modest with the sharing of the experience of their bodies, and that's all for them, as long as they are able to make that from an autonomous informed space. That's golden. Like, not this n
fear-based,
this
fear-mongering,
fear-based,
this "It's going to ruin you, it's going to ruin
also
you."
this objectified space, like, honestly,
Fuck yeah.
for the ways that we talk about sexual objectification, I do find that this is glaringly missing when it is one of the biggest pervasive ideas of sexual objectification that we abide by.
Mhm,
This has become so normalized, and yet when we get down to it, as I've shown, the base comes to it as your sex is seen as your value. And you know what? This still pervades. Like, this is why we have such jealousy around our
mhm,
relationships. Like, I am a polyamorous relationship anarchist person. And whenever I used to talk to people about this, they would always say, "Well, I can never do that." And when I prod further, it's because, especially for a lot of women, there's this belief that some sultry vixen, somebody who has better sex than you, is going to take your love and your security away. And when we have framed the value of women based on their sex so much, yeah, that makes god dang sense. Like,
right,
that's why. It has really infected a lot of how we approach these dynamics with one another and with ourselves. So it's really important to start the deconstruction process and kind of scrutinizing where we have gotten these ideas and how far they permeated, and if we want to choose to allow that to continue, or if we would rather adopt, as society continues to do and is natural to do, a more healthy and fitting idea for what sex and virginity and our relationship to our sexuality means to us.
Mhm.
Preach.
Word. So much word on that. Oh, Adelina. She never fails to impress.
Thank
They never
you.
fail to impress.
You.
Ah, all right. So we're gonna have to wrap up. Um, I could talk to you for hours. I hope you'll come back on
Oh,
about
absolutely.
something else. You let me know when the next thing gets sucked into play on that list.
You know you had so many good ones there. I'm
Yay!
I'm more than eager.
Yay! All right. Well, my lovelies, I hope that you enjoyed this episode. Please go ahead and subscribe at www.theintimacyally.com if you want to get your free self love guide, or if you want to find out more about my course that's coming up next year.
Ooh.
It is called Making Online Dating Magical.
Oh,
Because
yes.
if you're looking for some of this, I want to help you get it. So if you are only listening to this, I just held up my ring finger because I'm a nerd and really, really excited to get married next year. So,
Oh, shoot. Well, congrats. Congrats.
yeah, that's the stuff. If you can see this video, those are his photographs behind me. Woo, so cool.
Oh, okay.
Uh huh. And Adelina, how can people find you? How can they work with you?
Excellent. First and foremost, you can always Google my name, Adelina Adler, Adelina Adler, and my little Wix site will pop on up right there. You can also find me on Instagram at Ask Addie Adler, Addyer. And you can also, again, pretty soon, by the time I guess this is released or sometime in December, I'll be opening and launching a Discord channel named Sexplorations! Exclamation point with Adelina Adler. And there we will host, or I'll host, a community of people that of other sex nerds or people who are sex explorers and curious folks who want to get together, share community, talk, and have these kinds of discussions. I even opened up a segment called Sexual Philosophy, so people can just kind of.
Woo.
Ooh, yeah, I'm so excited for it. I'm just learning Discord, guys, so it takes a minute. I'm a geriatric millennial here. But yeah, you can also
Oh,
look up.
that's all fantastic. It is
Yeah,
all fantastic. Sorry, you can also look up.
you can also just look up Sexplorations with Adelina Adler on YouTube and Spotify again. It is older. I will start launching series. I just started interviewing some people for that. So as soon as I
Nice.
edit and get that
Hands
ball
in
rolling,
every pot.
yes.
Hands in every pot,
I'm a
Addie.
depressy girl though, so it takes a minute. It's gonna be a slow pot burn. It's a slow
It's all
cooker.
good, and and I will absolutely add all of those links in the show
Mhm.
notes, so
Excellent.
people will be able to find them lickety split.
I did
All
link them
right,
to that thing I sent you. Okay.
awesome, fantastic. All right, well, I hope that everybody out there will stay curious, be kind, and strive to have the best love and sex that you can. Bye.